The Media Institute, the foremost independent advocate for the First Amendment for over 4 decades, is one of the nation's leading nonpartisan organizations focused on media and communications policy. The Media Institute promotes freedom of speech, recognizes excellence in journalism, and encourages a competitive media environment and communications industry. Considering the current state of affairs in the nation's capital and across the country, our mission is more relevant than ever. Thanks to our sponsors and supporters. At the platinum level, AT&T, Charter Communications, Consumer Technology Association, iHeartMedia, LG Electronics USA, Tegna, Verizon Communications, and Viacom CBS. Our gold sponsors include America's Public Television Stations, CTIA, Everything Wireless, Education Networks of America, Interactive Advertising Bureau, National Association of Broadcasters, Comcast NBC Universal, and NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. Silver sponsors include ACA Connects, America's Communications Association, Advanced Television Systems Committee, ATSC, Cooley LLP, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Covington and Burling LLP, Cox Enterprises Inc., Davis Wright Tremaine LLP, DLA Piper, Lerman Center PLLC, News Media Alliance, T-Mobile, U.S. Telecom, Wiley, and Wilkinson Barker Nauer LLP. Thanks to all for making today's event possible. And now the President and CEO of the Media Institute, Rick Kaplan.
Hey, good afternoon, and welcome to our Communications Forum virtual luncheon for March. Thank you for joining us today. And a big thank you, as always, to our luncheon sponsors for making these events possible. And let me tell you a little bit what we have coming up. Next month on April 13th, our speaker, Senior Executive Vice President for External and Legislative Affairs at AT&T. Ed will give us the telecom industry perspective and perhaps share a few thoughts on this new Congress. That will be Tuesday, April 13th. And then on May 11th, we'll welcome FCC Commissioner Jeffrey Starks. You may remember him as the featured speaker at our gala in October 2019, but this will be his appearance as one of our luncheon speakers. And that date again is Tuesday, May 11th. Speaking of FCC commissioners, it is now my great pleasure to introduce Commissioner Nathan Simington by the U.S. Senate in 2020. He brings both private and public sector experience to the commission. Previously, he served as senior advisor at NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. In this role, Commissioner Simington worked on many aspects of telecom policy, including spectrum allocation, broadband access, and the U.S. government's role in the internet. Prior to joining the commission, he was senior counsel at Brightstar Corporation, an international mobile company. In this capacity, he negotiated transactions with leading providers in over 20 countries. Prior to joining Brightstar, he worked as an attorney in private practice. Commissioner Simington is a graduate of the University of Michigan Law School, and he also holds degrees from the University of Rochester and from Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. I have a hunch that Commissioner Simington has a rather colorful background. I know he grew up in Saskatchewan, Canada, and rumor has it that he was even a professional musician. But I'll leave it to the commissioner to fill in those details if he'd like to. And let me remind you that during the commissioner's presentation, you'll have a chance to ask questions using the Ask a Question feature on your screen. Just type your questions and send them in. And as a special bonus today, our Q&A session will be moderated by our chairman of the board and former FCC chairman, and we'll look forward to that. To welcome our distinguished speaker, Commissioner Nathan Simington.
Thank you very much, Rick, for the introduction. Thanks also to the entire Media Institute team for inviting me to speak at this event. It truly is a great honor to be here. This will be my first address to the Media Institute. It's a signal honor to have been invited to share this virtual podium with the galaxy of stars who have come before TMI during its more than 40 years. The Media Institute promoting freedom of speech, encouraging a competitive media environment and communications industry, and recognizing excellence in journalism align with and indeed inspire many of my own priorities as a commissioner of the FCC. Of course, the FCC has regulatory powers and obligations over radio and television, but in addition, members of the Commission enjoy the luxury of a unique bully pulpit to discuss pressing issues, such as those around which the Media Institute was founded. Of course, when I say bully pulpit, I'm sure we're all reminded of one speech in particular. 160 years on, indeed, where I'm thinking of Chairman Minnow's first speech as FCC chairman. It's become something of a modern classic. His description of television as a vast intellectual wasteland gave a new phrase to the English language. But beyond mere rhetoric, it raised questions that still trouble us today. How do we determine what the public interest is? What, if anything, is it appropriate for a regulator to do to direct or even merely to nudge the mass media? Is it responsible and public-spirited to foster what we would consider laudable content? Or is this, as the rejoinder might come, the attitude of snobs and pecksniffs? And assuming that a regulator is to act, how do the qualities and defects of a particular content cash out into public behaviors and attitudes? In full knowledge of the complexity of these questions, I'll duly rush in where wise men fear to tread. So today, I want to talk about the future of local journalism, how the FCC can, through policy, either feed its growth or watch it wither on the vine. And of course, I hope everyone will forgive redundancies or possibly dubious simplifications as I attempt to cover a lot of ground in terms suitable for the Harry Jr. associates taking notes. As some of you may already know, I'm engaging with stakeholders across the industry and the political spectrum regarding local journalism. Let's define local journalism for today as journalism that covers local issues and is produced in its region of distribution outside of the established centers of national production. While I believe that local news does indeed foster community and serve as a check on local abuses, this may be a matter of opinion, but what's beyond dispute is that local journalism, by definition, decentralizes the formation of media content and provides for organic diversity. Local journalism, by its mere existence, gives the lie to the idea, perhaps too prevalent today, that most of the country is for flying over. It's for passively serving as a receptacle for ideas and policies emanating from entrepôts and metropoles. I learned recently that something like 1/6 of all working journalists in the country, probably an actual majority of those producing principally online content, live in New York, Los Angeles, or Washington, D.C., and that proportion is growing. This geographic and social concentration means that those who are making decisions about what to cover and how to approach coverage are all likely to be riding the same subways, eating at the same restaurants, and drinking at the same bars. The cursus honorum from top colleges to a few large cities means that even with the best will in the world, up-and-coming journalists may talk mostly to members of a relatively narrow social class. The structure of their employment may restrict their opportunities to experience the scope, quality, and beauty of America as a whole. Our representative democracy ensures that everyone has local representation in Congress, but there's no comparable protection to ensure that journalism truly covers the whole of the American experience. Many expected then that the digital age would see a journalism renaissance with the explosion of independent voices and points of view and unprecedented diversity in focused topical coverage. With due respect to points of light in the fabric, I'm not convinced that it's clear that this projected renaissance has arrived. Instead, journalism of the kind that's largely produced on and for the internet seems to focus on issues of national moment on the one hand, national politics or international affairs, or on issues of national culture on the other, like reactions to the last season of the Game of Thrones. And of course, national cable news networks are, as the name says, national, just like it says on the box. Even independent creators, analysts, and journalists who self-host content on YouTube or other platforms, for example, generally play to national conversations. And why not? They're generally a little more controversial, a little more alarming, a little more engaging, and a little easier to use to raise eyebrows and hackles. And of course, you gain economies of scale. Economies of scale are important for driving clicks, and clicks drive revenue. Revenue drives content, and indeed, as journalism has concentrated on digital platforms and within national content categories, dollars and eyeballs have concentrated there too. These trends are continuing and intensifying. Note that none of the preceding is a value judgment on any particular journalist, outlet, media figure, or indeed on the overall quality of work at present. This is all about looking at structural lacunae. So then what have these trends meant for us as a culture? I think there are two things that are pretty clear, not controversial. First, we just could not be a more politically polarized society. And polarization has certainly grown in a way correlated with concentration of digital content into national topics. I don't take a position as to the causal direction of that relationship, but I'm sure there is a causal relationship there somewhere. It may just as well be a positive feedback loop by now. Second, trust in journalism has never been lower. Each day we reach some worrying new nadir of trust in reporting, and this has important material consequences for our health and well-being as a society. As I said, these are, I'm afraid, completely uncontroversial observations. They're facts about the world, which anyone paying any attention at all should be able to agree upon, and they're routinely reported in both the scholarly literature and the popular press, and by people of all political alignments. So shouldn't we be worried about this? Ought it not to create a moment of reflection for us? So it's against this backdrop that the FCC regulates broadcast media. And of course, we have to do so in an attitude of humility. Nonetheless, here are some things you probably already know about the state of local journalism, but again, I'll speak for the benefit of that poor junior associate. First, people trust it. More than any other kind of journalistic content, people look to their nightly news for information that they can count on. The journalist on the beat in front of the land records office, albeit perhaps a virtual one today, looking for shady doings at the city council, or the on-your-side consumer reporter who investigates a local mechanic overcharging for repairs. This may be a little Norman Rockwell, but it's still the best way to inform people of what's happening in their neighborhoods. And during the COVID pandemic, we've needed all of the trustworthy reporting that we can possibly get, even simple information like where to get vaccinated or what the mask policy is for the local grocery store is probably best distributed by local journalists. And indeed, it would probably be literally impossible for national news to do so because of the broad diversity of local mandates. Then second, it drives local ad revenue. Any broadcaster will tell you that broadcast ad dollars are made on local news, and that when they can, they invest in more rather than less local news production. That investment supports local jobs in the newsroom, and it spurs local investment in advertising. And then third, it's more challenging to profitably produce local journalism than ever before. You need mics on the ground. That costs a lot of money. And it's not like online companies have this in their business model. There's no criticism of online companies to say that their business models do not, in fact, contemplate local reporters with specialized mics on the ground knowledge in every city of every size across the United States. So if we look at the state of play with just one company, and not to single anybody out, but just to point out the structural economics and how these cash out in one particular respect, I'm going to slow down a little bit for dramatic effect. So Google, for example, and I could name other names, earns more local ad revenues than the entire broadcast industry combined. Google is a single company, okay? One company, more local ad revenue than every broadcast group put together. And it's not in the business model to send a local reporter to Lubbock or Youngstown to find out what's happening there. They're in a digital content distribution business. That's not on the economic model or the feature roadmap. And for all the immense benefits that social media and online companies have brought to our society, this simply isn't a role that they volunteered to play or that we should reasonably ask them to play. I don't blame them for this situation any more than I'd blame a national auto insurer for not operating a chain of garages. But on the other hand, if we value local journalism, as I believe we should, we have to understand the economic constraints that constitute the reality of local journalism today. And thus, if we care about local journalism, we must care about finding a sustainable business model for the future. And let me be clear, local journalism is in trouble. 2020 was rough from an ad revenue point of view, and it was only the political advertising of a hotly contested election that prevented ad revenue from cratering entirely. Broadcast groups are rightly worried about 2021 and even more rightly worried about 2023. It is sometimes said, of course, that the broadcast industry has cried wolf about the death of local journalism for a long time. But from my perspective, the wolf is now at the door, and margins on the production of local journalism are trending to become as thin as the hairs on our chinny chin chins. So something has to be done. The FCC, I believe, can do something. It can't reverse secular trends towards cultural flattening and national content. It can't, in the absence of a clear and specific congressional mandate, regulate internet companies like broadcasters. But it can get out of the way of broadcasters who are working hard to find a path toward a sustainable business model. We are all, of course, waiting for Prometheus. That sounds like some kind of play in endless pentameters that I don't want to read, perhaps by an Elizabethan existentialist, but we'll go with it. And while the issues there are nuanced and relate to whether and to what extent the FCC may modify its rules regarding media cross-ownership concentration, In the absence of a thoroughgoing analysis of that modification on rates of female and minority ownership of media outlets, the fact of the matter is that cross-ownership, national ownership, and the overall regulatory burden that broadcasters face, much of it a hangover from a very different era, those are squarely within the core remit of the FCC. And while we can talk about the particulars of the regulations, what so often gets lost in such conversations is the plain business fact that the broadcast industry faces a regulatory burden that's more significant than many other industries. So we look at the trend lines. Local journalism is in trouble. Broadcasters are in trouble. So at a first cut, in 10 years, if the FCC does nothing, what is it even regulating in the broadcast space? It may wind up having a mandate to regulate nothing at all. What diversity of ownership exactly will it be promoting in a world of collapse? Look on my regulations, ye mighty, and despair. The ownership of lone and level sands stretching far away. Now we might say, of course, sure, fine, they're having problems now, but ATSC 3.0 and data casting are just around the corner, and those technologies are going to bolster broadcast revenues eventually. Sure, possibly, eventually. But broadcasters don't need eventually, they need now. Further to the point, reality has put the lie to the viewpoint diversity concerns that once animated media ownership concentration rules of any variety. When we've had greater media ownership concentration, economies of scale have permitted broadcast groups to invest in their greatest revenue generating differentiator. What is that? Local journalism, local nightly news. That's where the ad dollars are still being made. And in the same market, broadcast groups don't want their content broadcast in triplicate. They want to own diverse content within their markets because they want to capture as many eyeballs as they can. And since people already have a place to go for national content, broadcast journalism is where they go for the differentiator, the content that's most relevant to them, local and diverse. Different stations producing different content for different viewers in local markets. That drives ad CPM, which is what broadcasters want. Of course, we want female and minority broadcast media ownership, unquestionably. But to have that, we need a healthy broadcast industry as a whole. We can't permit the vestigial tail of ownership rules to wag the dog. We need sensible, slimmed down regulations for the world we live in, not the world that was. And by the way, that approach should enhance viewpoint diversity by permitting investment in local journalism, which is the differentiator broadcast groups need to compete. I'm not here proposing a particular alternative regulatory regime. I'm still making a study of the industry. I don't want to prejudge anything, and I want to be sure that I've heard from all stakeholders before I solidify opinions on what constitutes sound policy, not least as to the limits of the FCC's mandate and as to what's appropriate. But I will say that as a matter of values, I want a healthy, thriving broadcast ecosystem. And the way to accomplish that must surely be to unleash the creative power of broadcasters and permit them to compete with digital platforms using every tool at their disposal. The Media Institute has always stood for the salutary effects of competition. And from what I've seen so far, I believe media liberalization will promote salutary competition. I'll be happy to get further into the weeds in the Q&A, but that's where I stand right now. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Hey, thank you, Commissioner. Very interesting. And boy, you can tell you really dug into this in just the short time you've been at the commission and have some very good insights on this. So right now, we're going to go to our question and answer session. Let me remind the audience to just go ahead and keep sending your questions in. They may not be showing on your own personal screens there, but they're coming in here to our production center. So we ask you to keep them coming in. I'm going to turn it over now to our chairman of the board, Chairman Wiley, and let him take away the Q&A. Dick?
Rick, thank you very much. And Commissioner, much appreciated for those remarks. Our first question is from Gary Arlen. He's a frequent questioner and a very good one. What is your view, Commissioner, on the administration's infrastructure plan with its 5G and broadband components? How will the FCC deal with the pertinent factors?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So the administration's infrastructure plan is, of course, a very ambitious plan. I see its roots in some plans that were proposed by members under the prior administration, of course. There's no secret there. And certainly the rationale for extensive infrastructure investment has never been more certain. The question becomes then, what should be the allocation mechanism for determining that? I don't mean to ideologically prejudge this, and there are many components of the current infrastructure plan that I think warrant continued careful study at the Commission. But I'm intrinsically worried whenever there's an infrastructure plan that believes it can figure out where infrastructure should be allocated nationally. It's very often possible to do this at a rather crude level, but it's very, very difficult to drill down into the level of specificity that you require. So let me put some flesh on those bones. So, for example, there is now a call for 100 up, 100 down as the standard for defining broadband. And that makes a great deal of sense in many markets. We do not want to commit federal resources to building infrastructure that will rapidly be obsoleted and that will not therefore be fit for long-term purpose. As against that, there are also over 20 million Americans who don't have any broadband connectivity right now. And while, of course, we're attempting to address that as much as possible, at that point, you start to get to the edge cases. At that point, you start to get to underserved markets that have never been able to attract a market entrant. You start to get to geographically isolated locations. You start to get to underserved urban areas where infrastructure will not be the primary factor. So when you put all that together, that we start getting to the edge cases, and it's not clear to me that that's exactly the right standard for the country as a whole. And I note that with current RDOF commitments, for example, that we would risk then designating some things that we funded as broadband as no longer being broadband. And I'm not even sure what the implications of that would be. So not to drift too far afield, but I would say that there's a lot of complexity there. We have to make sure to capture the full complexity of the nation. And I would encourage Congress to work with us very closely on the Commission to make sure that we can thoroughly kick the tires.
Commissioner, another question. See that the likelihood of 3-2 Democratic leadership of the FCC, how do you think that would affect the agenda at the Commission? For example, do you expect the Commission to be discussing network neutrality yet again?
Everyone's favorite topic, Mr. Chairman. So first of all, I'd like to note that during my tenure on the Commission, we have engaged in what I would consider a strongly bipartisan and thoroughly reasoned policy with decisions going forward. So, I'm very happy with the spirit of compromise and discussion that prevails among current leadership, and I've got no doubt that that will continue even once there is a partisan majority. Once again, as far as how this will affect the question of net neutrality, it's of course no secret that net neutrality is a slogan that's been around for 18 years and has metamorphosed multiple times. So when we ask, will there be net neutrality? There almost certainly will be because of existing political commitments. When we ask, what will net neutrality mean? Well, I note that the net neutrality of the 2015 OIO had an entirely different rationale from previous net neutrality, and no doubt we will wind up seeing still different logic. Well, I don't want to prejudge anything, but I would assume we would see still different logic given the increasing untenability, I think, of monopoly arguments in the age of, for example, the new expansion in NGSO satellite high-speed broadband. As far as, and of course, other related technologies. As far as discussions, therefore, I expect discussions certainly to take place. I expect a conversation to be very thoughtful, and I would also expect an economic analysis now that we have the natural experiment, so to speak, of 2015 to 2017 and then 2018 to 2021, to look at real-world effects of various provisions of Title II on infrastructure investment and therefore the question of broadband access. If the rationale for net neutrality is in part to close the digital divide, we have to ask whether it helped do that the first time. And we have to ask, if we're going to have Title II, what exactly we want to have with Title II. So I expect it to be a protracted conversation that will lead to an evidence-based conclusion.
Commissioner, you mentioned ATSC 3.0, next gen television, if you will. Do you think that this new technology could be used to bolster local journalism at broadcast stations?
Well, Mr. Chairman, ATSC 3.0 certainly is much more feature-rich than ATSC 1.0. And it's certainly possible to imagine aspects of interactivity that are enabled by ATSC 3.0 to have relevance in local broadcasting and local journalism. Journalism in broadcasting has always had to consciously cultivate the feedback mechanism to the broadcaster, because broadcasting in the old model was intrinsically a one-way street. And of course, many local broadcasters and stations tried very hard and cultivated that very hard, but the medium was intrinsically one way. With ATSC 3.0, I think there's the potential for much tighter and more engaged feedback loops, and for greater degrees of interactivity that may allow broadcasters to develop new features, but also to replicate some features that are currently available only on bilateral IP. So, I think there's potential for a very interesting evolution there, certainly.
Commissioner, what do you hope or expect to see from the Supreme Court upcoming decision on media ownership?
That is indeed a fascinating question. I am committed above everything else to regulatory certainty. So I think once we have a Supreme Court decision, that's certainty. And one way or the other, the Commission will, of course, abide by the Supreme Court's decision. As for the substantive merits, I don't want to get over my skis too much, either in criticism or in praise of the Third Circuit. I will just note that the commencement of this litigation, which was, I believe, 18 years ago in the first Prometheus case, assumes a very different set of facts about the media ownership landscape, the role of broadcast media in society, the comparative uptake of broadcast journalism versus journalism on other platforms, etc., that just are increasingly not in evidence. And I also note that the FCC has tried really hard over the years to comply with what the Third Circuit is asking. We haven't somehow been able to get it right, or else they haven't been satisfied with what we've done. So above all, from the Supreme Court, I want finality. I think the FCC has a mandate, of course, to broaden the base of media ownership. I think there's a conversation worth having now about who exactly wants to invest their capital in that. Like, so for example, if we were finding that the people that we were hoping to ask to invest in media ownership no longer find that their most desired, who knows? Perhaps they want to invest in Bitcoin instead. Perhaps they want to invest in real estate empires. The Commission can hardly tell them no. So if we can if we can do our part, I don't want to claim too much power here, but if we can do our part to make broadcast journalism an attractive thing to own, then that, I think, will do as much towards promoting the media ownership goals as actual regulations partitioning the area. But as I said, the thing I want most from the Supreme Court is certainty on the issue, so that we can all adapt to it and get on with our lives.
One of our viewers has asked, how should the government measure the output level of local broadcasting and journalism?
That's a tough question. It's a tough question in part because as you pick at every term in there, you start to unravel a thread that, not to mix my metaphors too badly, although ship's probably sailed, but might lead you down a rabbit hole. So as far as measuring the output level of local broadcasting and journalism, I think one approach is simply to look at hours of locally sourced production. It's always difficult. To determine exactly. For example, are you going to look at a split of national versus local stories? How you determine what's a national or local story? For example, a report on a national program might include a discussion of its implications at the local level. It's tough to differentiate. I think it's better to look at how at the sourcing. If the source is national, then the content is putatively national. Even if it's on a local thing, it can only be local for one place, and for everyone else, it's national. On the other hand, if it's local reporting that takes place in the community and is about local things, then it's going to appear on local broadcasters because that's the market for it. So I think if you look at the source, you get an idea as to the content, and that might be the best approach to take. Of course, again, we have to do this within an atmosphere of humility and not get too picky, I think, or on the other hand, get too specific with our mandates, because at that point people start teaching to the test.
Commissioner, as you know, there's a 2018 quadrennial review still pending at the commission. Would you anticipate that once the Supreme Court has ruled in the media ownership case, that the commission will turn to that pending proceeding?
Of course, I don't have the agenda setting power, but I can certainly say based on the careful record and attention to congressional mandates of the current acting chair, I expect that this would be an issue that the commission would be eager to take up once it was clear how to proceed.
And one issue that is in that pending proceeding has to do with local radio. Would you expect to see any determinations of the commission forthcoming on, for example, how many FMs you could own in one station, one owner can own in one market?
Well, once we proceed to review, Mr. Chairman, I think then it becomes more clear. Once we've got the facts, we've proceeded to review, then it becomes more clear what, if anything, would be an appropriate action. I would generally favor liberalization in many of these cases, but I want it to be fact-based and evidence-driven. And if that's the way that the report points out as the appropriate direction for the commission to proceed, then I think there might be substantial interest at the commission in precisely that course of action.
We've got one other question from a viewer. Tell us about how the FCC commissioners work together. Of course, that's difficult in the pandemic. Is it possible to put politics aside in this hyper-political time?
I am happy to say that that at least from my perspective, the FCC has fully lived up to its reputation as an expert agency and a highly impartial one throughout the pandemic, and that's, I think, reflected in its leadership. So I strongly value my relationship with all of my colleagues of both parties. I'm happy to say that we've embarked on a spirit of compromise, mutual respect, and that we've kept our communications channels wide open with one another. So I've pointed again to the bipartisan record of decisions over the last few months, and I think again that reflects a commitment on everyone's part to doing the nation's business expeditiously and not allowing things to get derailed. And again, with the urgency of many of the agenda items before us and with clear congressional mandates to deliver those quickly, I think it's really focused our minds on working together for the common good.
Commissioner, how do you think conversations at the FCC will progress with regard to Section 230, and how, in your view, could that alter competition in journalism?
Yes, indeed. Well, that's a very deep question, so I'm going to take it up in parts. Hopefully, I'll cover all the parts. So, just as a little recent history, everyone will no doubt recall that that as of last summer, there was still a significant public question over whether the commission had any rulemaking authority whatsoever with respect to Section 230. My sense is that conversation advanced somewhat when the then general counsel of the FCC, Tom Johnson, publicly posted his reasoning on an FCC webpage in October of 2020, explaining the reasons why he thought it would be appropriate for the FCC to make rules under Section 230. So that's just, obviously, that's a threshold question. Does the FCC have any role? And it can't be regarded as fully settled until such time as the FCC is seen fit to engage in such rulemaking, if it ever does, and that reasoning has been tested in court. Certainly, I find it convincing enough, but I'm not a judge, and this is something that would clearly gore someone's ox and would thus be litigated, and I think we can't regard it as finally determined until that point. So, nonetheless, I think it did open the door somewhat. And I think it opened the door on the larger question of Section 230 reform that had been brewing among both parties. I mean, obviously, former President Trump's view on reforming or abolishing 230 was he was very vocal about it. It was made part of negotiation, even brinksmanship in some bills. I also note that President Biden, while a candidate, endorsed several times repeal of Section 230, and that Section 230 has been questioned by members of both houses and by members of both parties. So it's certainly viewed as a nexus for reform. And one of those, and of course, given the potential for FCC jurisdiction there, if it's a nexus for reform and the FCC can appropriately exercise its rulemaking power, then perhaps the FCC, rather than Congress, will be one of the venues in which reform takes place. Now, as to the question of how this could affect competition in journalism, I think people have put a lot of weight on 230 that it may not necessarily be able to bear. Section 230 is after all not a license to engage in behavior. It's not a wholesale grant of jurisdiction over online content, which is probably rubbing up against the Constitution anyway. But what it does is, and that's most relevant here, is it allows the posting of content without that content thereby automatically becoming actionable. And so, as far as how this could affect competition in journalism, well, we have to ask how it's currently affecting competition in journalism to see how its reform or abrogation or alteration would then have an effect. Now, the difference, of course, fundamentally between social media companies, online companies on the one hand, and journalists on the other hand, is that journalists write for publication, whereas online companies of the sort that are always brought into the discussion of Section 230 reform aggregate. And the aggregation function therefore means that someone other than the company itself is the author. And that's not to say, obviously, that Facebook or Google or Amazon or whoever don't author things under their own names, making a clear distinction between public content and content authored by the platform, but rather that the majority of the content on these in the social parts of these platforms are third-party content. And so I could see this going in a number of directions. If third-party content is made more difficult to post, whether that is, or I should say, more difficult for a company to safely permit the posting of, whether that's because of heightened litigation exposure in one area or in another, but just taking litigation exposure for posted content as a domain, then the companies will have to increase their already very extensive oversight and review of what gets posted. It will become more frictional. There will no doubt be both more false positives and more false negatives and more lawsuits, and thus a certain amount of chilling of posting, whatever specific form that may take. And if that's the case, then journalistic content, which is not being posted in this kind of way, and instead is just being authored, will not be comparably burdened. So it will be beneficial to the journalistic competitors to the online companies. But really, this is just such a broad field. I would almost need to know a little bit more about the direction that we're looking to push before I could predict the outcome. I think one thing is certain, though. If social media companies do find themselves turned into journalism companies by some 230 reform or set of reforms, then that would drastically change the entire landscape. I would say, given their financial resources, it would change the entire investment landscape. And at that point, I think we are truly in uncharted territory. I would not know how to proceed.
Commissioner, you've been very generous with your time. We have just a final question for you, and it's more of a personal one. You've been on the job for a few months now. Has there been anything that surprised you about your role as a commissioner?
Well, I can say there have been a number of surprising things. It's surprising every day. I would say that the landscape of things that we touch is so broad that that just having a synoptic view is a full-time job. Frankly, I just spend all my time reading memos, reading reports, reading white papers, and I still feel like I'm trying to drink the ocean with a tablespoon. But as far as something really surprising, I think the thing that most surprised me is how incredibly good the FCC staff is. The FCC staff is just simply the most professional group of people I've ever worked with. Everyone is a subject matter expert. Even very junior lawyers and other personnel have just been 100% on top of things all day, every day. It's a truly inspiring group to work with. I'm in awe of the collective repository of knowledge, of history, and of judgment that we have at the FCC on staff. So that was maybe the most surprising thing. I knew they'd be good. I had no idea anyone could be quite this good.
Thank you very much. Rick, let me turn it back to you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for those insightful questions, and thanks to our audience for sharing such good questions. And thank you again, Dick, for a great job moderating here. Commissioner, if I could just follow up a little bit with my own question. I was thinking, first of all, I want to commend you for realizing the importance of local journalism. I mean, it is a critical factor, and time and again, we've seen that in natural disasters and all sorts of situations where it's been the local broadcasters and local media that have been on the ground and providing the support and information that have, actually saved lives. So, we can't overstate the importance of local journalism. And I commend you for making that a priority of yours. Let me ask a question in that regard. The FCC has been concerned with ownership diversity, for decades. And I think maybe a case can be made that concern is stemmed from using ownership diversity as sort of a proxy for viewpoint diversity, the feeling that the airwaves as, owned by the public, should be used for the greatest possible viewpoint diversity. And yet, in terms of a viable business model, I think it's been pretty well established that consolidation is a means of creating business models that are, better for the economic sustainability of broadcasting. Do you think we're at a point where consolidation has been more or less accepted now as something that's just a reality that we need to accept and move forward and find ways to enhance viewpoint diversity within that consolidated framework, or is there still a tension there about this whole notion of consolidation?
That's a great question, Rick, and I don't want to give short shrift to people who are worried about consolidation. I think I think people who have let's not forget, right, that broadcast journalism of the type that we're talking about is still a young field. That there are lots of people for whom it was born in living memory, and they've grown up with the field throughout their entire lives. I mean, and so there's always evolving standards, and I would say there, if we look at the early broadcast media landscape in the United States, it would simply be silly to say that the owners never put a thumb on the scale. Indeed, it would be a hard thing to expect of anyone. However, if we look at modern corporate structures, I think modern broadcast groups are very different creatures from the consolidated vertical enterprises, all under the thumb of a media baron that some people still fear. I think modern broadcast groups are looking to maximize the value of each station, not to turn those stations into personal mouthpieces. And when we look at maximizing the value of individual stations, there's probably a level at which further consolidation becomes uneconomical. But I'd like to let the market discover that to some degree. There's no question that common pooling of resources in, for example, advertising marketing can be an advantage across broadcast groups, or of technical security and IT resources. I don't see any reason why that should be duplicated, why the entire organizational structure of each of those should be duplicated at each individual station. That seems like a heavy lift. But what I'm seeing groups telling me that they want to promote, and what my review of the facts on the ground seems to agree with them on, is that broadcast groups see strong local journalism with station independence as a fundamental asset. And so acquiring a station only to gut it and turn it into a clone of another station is probably a poor business model for them. So I think we have to look at market behavior and ask what harms we're solving for. As far as diversity, Rick, you raised the excellent point that the FCC's mandate is for viewpoint diversity. I think one way to get at meaningful viewpoint diversity is greater localism, and indeed the FCC and its statute explicitly contemplate that all over the place. So greater localism, if If we say that localism is the successful business model, then the fact that a local broadcaster belongs to a larger affiliated group that has an economic incentive to invest in and support its increased localism and activities at the level of individual stations doesn't seem to me to be as much of a problem as some people would worry. Of course, I'm open to correction on this, but that's how it seems to me right now.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. Thank you very much. Well, I think that we're coming up on our time limit here, so I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but certainly, Commissioner, thank you for being with us today. It's really a great pleasure and honor for us to have you join us, and I'm sure our viewers enjoyed this presentation. Chairman Wiley, thank you again for leading a great Q&A session, and we look forward to future collaborations here and to having you back, Commissioner, and we appreciate your interest in the Media Institute, and I'm glad we share these values. I want to thank our sponsors again. Thank you all for being here today and for your ongoing support of the Communications Forum Luncheon Series. Special thanks to Dave Arland of Arland Communications, and John Taylor of LG Electronics, and of course our Chairman of the Board, Mr. Dick Wiley. So we'll look forward to seeing you back here on April 13th with our speaker, Ed Gillespie of AT&T. So for today, we'll wind up. Thank you again, and have a great day.
Thank you to our guest speaker today. Thank you to the Navy Band, and a big thank you again to our sponsors. We'll see you next month.